I came home from my morning walk to find an orange notice tucked under my windshield wiper. My first thought was that I had forgotten to pay a parking ticket. Then I got close enough to read the letterhead and understood that what I was holding was something different, and in some ways worse. It was an official violation notice from the Sycamore Ridge Homeowners Association, signed by Board President Clifton Reeves, informing me that my 2019 pickup truck was classified as a commercial-style vehicle in violation of community appearance guidelines, and that if it was not removed from my driveway within 48 hours, it would be towed at my expense. I stood in my driveway in the morning sun and read it twice. My truck is a standard pickup. Dark blue for doors clean. There is no company name on it. There is no equipment mounted to the bed. There is nothing on or about it that suggests commercial use of any kind. It has been parked in that same driveway every single day for the 14 months since I moved to Sycamore Ridge, and in 14 months nobody had said a word about it. I folded the notice carefully and put it in my shirt pocket and walked inside. My name is Jeff Calloway. I am 70 years old. I moved to Sycamore Ridge after my wife Nora passed, looking for somewhere manageable and quiet where I could figure out what the second half of my retirement looked like without her in it. Before retirement, I spent 22 years as a municipal court judge. Before that, I practiced municipal law for 8 years. In total, I have spent the better part of 4 decades presiding over or arguing cases involving procedural abuse, selective enforcement, and people in small positions of institutional power doing disproportionate damage to ordinary people who did not know how to push back. I know what an abuse of authority looks like. I was looking at one. I did not grow up expecting to become a judge. My father was a mechanic who worked 6 days a week and came home with oil under his fingernails and enough dignity to fill a much larger house than the one we lived in. We did not have money, but we had pride and we had standards, and my father had a particular intolerance for people who used whatever small authority they possessed to make life harder for people who could not defend themselves. He called it the smallest kind of cowardice. I have never found a better description. I worked my way through college and through law school on scholarships and part-time jobs, and the specific determination of someone who understands that nobody is coming to hand you anything. I practiced municipal law for 8 years before I was appointed to the bench at 42. I was not the youngest judge in my jurisdiction, but I was close. For 22 years I heard cases. Traffic violations, small claims, administrative disputes, code enforcement challenges, landlord-tenant conflicts. The cases were rarely glamorous, but they were consistently instructive about human nature, specifically about how institutions behave when they believe nobody is watching closely enough to hold them accountable. I saw it constantly. The city inspector who enforced codes selectively. The housing board that followed its own rules only when convenient. The committee chair who had held the position so long he had confused his personal preferences with official policy. I retired at 64. Nora and I had plans. Travel, mostly, and a vegetable garden she had been promising herself for years, and the particular luxury of mornings without schedules. We had 18 months of it before the illness came, and then we had 8 months of something else, and then I was alone. I bought the Sycamore Ridge house because the ground floor layout was simple, and because the community felt calm, and because I genuinely believed that what remained of my life deserved some peace in it. Then Clifton Reeves put a notice on my windshield, and I remembered what my father used to say. Some things you walk away from. Some things walk up and find you, and walking away from those is a different matter entirely. Before I responded to the notice, I spent a week learning about the man who had signed it. Clifton Reeves was 64 years old, a former real estate agent who had been HOA board president at Sycamore Ridge for 6 consecutive years. I found that detail immediately notable. 6 years is a long time for a volunteer neighborhood position. People who hold that kind of role for that long generally fall into one of 2 categories. Those who are genuinely devoted to the community and cannot find anyone willing to replace them, and those who have arranged things so that replacement becomes inconvenient. I attended my first board meeting on a Thursday evening to see which kind Clifton was. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a pleasant enough room that Clifton ran with the quiet authority of a man who had never once been seriously challenged in it. He moved through agenda items at a pace designed to prevent meaningful discussion. When a resident named Herschel Baines tried to ask a question about a landscaping bill, Clifton acknowledged him, gave a 2-sentence answer that did not address the question, and moved to the next item before Herschel could follow up. When another resident raised her hand during a vote, Clifton noted her objection for the record and proceeded with the vote anyway. I sat in the back row and said nothing. I took 3 pages of notes. I was not ready to speak yet. I have learned over a long career that the most dangerous thing you can do when entering a new proceeding is reveal what you know before you know enough. I was still learning the terrain. Every HOA is legally required to provide its governing documents to any resident upon request. I submitted my written request the morning after the board meeting. The documents arrived 4 days later. 114 pages that I read over 2 evenings with a yellow highlighter and a legal pad beside me. The vehicle restriction Clifton had cited was on page 37. It was real, but it was also specific. The restriction applied to vehicles used for active commercial purposes, defined in the document's own language as vehicles bearing visible commercial markings, company signage, or mounted commercial equipment. My truck had none of those things. The notice Clifton had placed on my windshield was not an interpretation of the bylaw. It was a fabrication dressed up as one. But that was not the most interesting thing I found. On page 72, in a section titled Board Composition and Terms, Article 7 stated clearly that board members were limited to 2 consecutive 2-year terms before being required to stand down for a minimum of 1 full term. 2 terms. 4 years maximum of consecutive service. I checked the dates in the meeting minutes I had requested alongside the governing documents. Clifton Reeves had been serving continuously for 6 years. He had been in violation of his own community's charter for at least 2 years. Possibly longer, depending on when the provision had last been enforced, if it had ever been enforced at all. I underlined the passage twice and drew a circle around it in red ink. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. I had come to this community looking for quiet. What I had found instead was a case. I sent Clifton a formal written notice disputing the vehicle violation. 4 pages, certified mail, return receipt requested. The first page explained in precise terms why my truck did not meet the bylaw definition of a commercial vehicle. The second page cited the specific language of Article 7 and the dates of his consecutive service. The third page outlined what state HOA regulations say about term limit violations and the removal procedures they trigger. The fourth page asked him to withdraw the vehicle notice in writing within 10 days and to respond to the term limit question in the same time frame. He called me instead, 4 days after the letter was delivered. The call was not friendly. He told me the board had broad interpretive authority and that his decision on the vehicle was final. He told me I was a new resident who did not yet fully understand how the community operated and that he was happy to explain things to me if I came and spoke with him in person. There was a particular quality to his condescension, practiced and smooth, the kind that has worked on many people for a long time. I let him finish. Then I told him that interpretive authority does not extend to rewriting plain language, that the vehicle restriction he had cited had a specific definition that my truck did not meet, and that his response to Article 7 and the consecutive term question was still required in writing by the end of the week. There was a pause. I told him to read Section 4, Article 7, if he had not done so already, and that I looked forward to his written response. Then I said good night and ended the call. Within the hour, 2 neighbors had texted me to say Clifton had called them asking what they knew about the new resident on Elm Court. Good, I thought. He is paying attention now. Word travels quickly in a community of 206 homes. Within 2 weeks of the confrontation, 5 of my neighbors had come to me separately with their own stories. Julieta Garcia was a 67-year-old retired nurse who had been fined 3 times for wind chimes she had installed on her back porch, which faced her own private garden and was not visible from any street or common area. She had paid 2 of the fines and was contesting the third, but she had no idea on what grounds. Herschel Baines, the retired teacher whose hand Clifton had dismissed at the board meeting, had been told his backyard vegetable garden violated an aesthetic community standard. When Herschel asked to see the specific bylaw, he was told the board had discretionary authority to interpret aesthetic matters. I asked him to show me the letter. There was no bylaw cited because no such bylaw existed. The Vanzetti family had been waiting 8 months for approval to repair a section of fence damaged in a storm. Their applications kept being tabled at board meetings for procedural reasons that changed each time they asked for clarification. 2 other residents, both of whom asked me not to use their names, told me they had attempted to run for the board 2 years ago during the annual election. They had submitted their nomination forms on time and in the correct format. They had been told their nominations were invalid. No reason had ever been given in writing. I listened to each of them carefully. I took notes. I created a folder for each case. Then I created a master document and began entering everything in chronological order with supporting documentation attached. I had presided over enough proceedings to know what a pattern looks like when it is sitting in front of you. This was a pattern, and a documented pattern, brought before the right body in the right format, is one of the most durable things in any legal or administrative proceeding. In most states, HOA financial records are accessible to all residents by right. I submitted a formal written request for 3 years of financial statements, meeting minutes, and vendor contracts. Clifton delayed the first response by 2 weeks, citing administrative backlog. I sent a second letter, shorter this time, citing the statutory deadline for document disclosure in our state and the specific penalties for noncompliance. The documents arrived on the final day of the deadline window, clearly assembled quickly and without much organization. I spent 4 evenings going through them. I was not looking for obvious theft. Obvious theft is rare because people who steal obviously do not last long enough to become HOA presidents for 6 years. What I was looking for was the subtler version, the kind that hides inside legitimate-looking transactions and requires patience and attention to surface. I found it in the vendor contracts. The landscaping contract had been renewed every year for 5 consecutive years with the same company, at rates I estimated were significantly above market by comparing them against publicly available pricing from comparable vendors in our area. That alone was noteworthy, but not necessarily improper. Then I searched the business registration records for the landscaping company. The registered owner was a man whose last name I recognized from the meeting minutes. He had been listed as Clifton's emergency contact in the board's internal directory. One phone call to a neighbor who had lived at Sycamore Ridge for 11 years confirmed what I suspected. The landscaping company owner was Clifton's brother-in-law. A board president directing community contracts to a family member's business without disclosure to the community. That was not a gray area. That was a conflict of interest under state HOA regulations, clearly and specifically defined. My master document was now 43 pages long. I spent 6 weeks after that doing nothing visible. I know that sounds like inaction. It was the opposite. 6 weeks of making sure that every piece of documentation in my 43-page file was accurate, cross-referenced, and supported by source material that could withstand scrutiny. 6 weeks of making sure that when I moved, I was ready, because in my experience the people who lose cases they should win almost always lose them for the same reason. They moved before they were ready. I contacted our state's HOA regulatory office and spoke with an investigator named Wendell Price, who confirmed that the term limit violation alone was grounds for removal proceedings and that the vendor contract situation warranted a formal financial audit. He asked me to send him the relevant documentation and said he would review it. I contacted a community attorney named B. Solano who had been recommended to me by Wendell. She reviewed my file and told me it was one of the most thorough resident complaints she had encountered in 20 years of HOA law. She also advised me on the petition process, which was the mechanism through which residents could force an emergency special meeting of the full community. Then I called a quiet meeting at my home with Julieta, Herschel, the Vanzettis, and the 2 residents who preferred to remain unnamed. I served coffee and told them what I had found and what I was planning. I told them that what had been done to each of them individually was frustrating. What I had documented collectively was something the board could not dismiss or procedurally maneuver around. I asked if they wanted to be part of what came next. Every one of them said yes without hesitation. The petition process is written into Sycamore Ridge's own governing documents. A petition signed by 20% of homeowners, 41 signatures from our 206 homes, triggers a mandatory special meeting that the board is legally required to schedule within 30 days and cannot refuse, delay, or cancel. I drafted the petition to address 3 specific items: the term limit violation and Clifton's continued illegal tenure, the vendor contract and its conflict of interest implications, and the pattern of selective bylaw enforcement as documented across multiple resident cases. I did not circulate it aggressively. I did not go door to door with a clipboard making speeches. I shared it with my neighbors, explained what it was and why it mattered, and let them share it with people they trusted. The signatures came back steadily and without drama, the way things move in a community where the frustration has been building for years and someone has simply provided a legitimate channel for it to move through. I needed 41 signatures. I collected 87 in 9 days. I delivered the petition to Clifton Reeves by certified mail on a Tuesday morning. Later that week, a neighbor who lives 2 doors down from Clifton mentioned to me that he had sat on his front porch that evening for a long time without going inside. I understood that. Sometimes you need a moment to absorb the fact that a situation has moved beyond your control. Clifton did not accept the situation quietly. In the 2 weeks between the petition delivery and the scheduled special meeting, he made several moves. He sent a letter to all Sycamore Ridge residents describing me as a disruptive newcomer pursuing a personal vendetta against a board that had served the community faithfully for years. He organized an informal gathering at the clubhouse for residents he considered sympathetic, which I was told by 3 attendees was less a community conversation and more an extended complaint about outside interference. And he had a local attorney send me a letter suggesting that my document requests, my conversations with neighbors, and my petition activities might constitute harassment under certain interpretations of community association law. I read the harassment letter carefully. It cited no specific statute. It named no specific act. It was a pressure tactic, the legal equivalent of a loud noise designed to make someone flinch and reconsider. I filed it at the back of my folder. I also noticed something in Clifton's letter to residents. In his rush to respond to the petition and build opposition, he had sent the letter using a distribution method that violated the notification procedures in the governing documents. Specifically, the requirement that formal community communications be sent through the official HOA channel and logged in the communication record. He had used a personal email list instead. I added that to my master document. It was now 51 pages. The special meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse. I arrived 15 minutes early. By the time the meeting started, the room held more residents than I had seen in any community gathering since moving to Sycamore Ridge. I counted chairs and estimated that close to 80% of the community's homeowners were present. That kind of turnout does not happen by accident. It happens when people have been waiting for a long time for something to change and have finally decided to show up and say so. Clifton opened the meeting and moved immediately to establish control of the agenda. He announced the order of business as he had prepared it, which placed his own response to the petition first and allocated resident comment to the final portion of the meeting. I raised a point of order inside the first 3 minutes. I stated, citing the specific bylaw governing petition-triggered special meetings, that under the community's own rules the agenda for a special meeting called by resident petition is set by the petitioners, not by the board, and that the board's role in such a meeting is to respond to the petition items, not to frame them. Clifton said the board retained procedural authority over all meetings. I cited the page number and the article. Several people in the room pulled out copies of the governing documents that I had suggested they review beforehand. Clifton sat down. I presented my case over the next 40 minutes. I did not use dramatic language. I did not make accusations beyond what my documents supported. I walked the room through the term limit provision and the dates of Clifton's service. I presented the business registration documents showing the relationship between the landscaping vendor and Clifton's brother-in-law, alongside the contract rates and my market comparison. I presented the resident cases, Julietta's wind chime fines, Herschel's vegetable garden, the Vanzetti fence, the rejected nominations, as documented examples of a consistent pattern of enforcement that served the board's interests rather than the community's rules. I did not raise my voice once. I did not need to. The documents did the work that volume would have done poorly. When I finished presenting, the meeting opened for resident comment. What followed was something I had not fully anticipated, even after weeks of preparation. Julieta Garcia spoke first. She stood at the microphone with the composure of a woman who had spent decades delivering difficult news to patients and families and was not going to be intimidated by a neighborhood meeting. She described her wind chime fines calmly and completely, and when she finished she held up the printed bylaw pages I had given her and noted that the word wind chimes appeared nowhere in them. Herschel Baines spoke about his vegetable garden. He brought photographs. The garden was in his backyard, screened by a 6-foot fence, impossible to see from any street. He said he had been growing tomatoes and peppers and summer squash, and that he had received a violation notice describing this as an aesthetic concern for the community. He asked the room to consider how a garden that no one could see from outside his property could affect anyone's aesthetics. The Vanzetti family presented their 8 months of correspondence about the fence. Every email, every application, every board response tabling the matter for new procedural reasons each time. Their son, who had come to the meeting to support them, held up the stack of paper and did not say anything. He did not need to. Then people I had never met came to the microphone. A woman who had been fined for a doormat. A man whose holiday decorations had been cited 3 days after they went up, while identical decorations 2 streets over remained without comment for the entire season. A resident who had asked for the community pool maintenance schedule for 2 consecutive years and had never received it. 40 minutes of testimony. Story after story, each one individually small and collectively enormous. When the comment period closed, the room moved to a vote on the 3 resolutions I had drafted. Removal of Clifton Reeves from the board for term limit violations. Referral of the vendor contract to the state HOA regulatory office for formal audit. Appointment of a temporary board chair pending a full community election. All 3 passed. The vote on Clifton's removal was not close. In the weeks that followed the special meeting, several things happened in an order that felt, to me, entirely predictable. The state HOA regulatory office opened a formal financial audit of the Sycamore Ridge vendor contracts. Clifton retained a private attorney and issued a statement through him denying any impropriety and describing the special meeting as a procedurally irregular event orchestrated by a small group of disruptive residents. The attorney sent a letter to the temporary board chair questioning the validity of the removal vote on procedural grounds that be Solano reviewed and dismissed in a 4-paragraph response. The audit took 11 weeks. Its findings confirmed what my documents had suggested. The landscaping vendor relationship constituted an undisclosed conflict of interest under state HOA regulations. The above-market contract rates had resulted in the community being overcharged by an estimated $38,000 over 3 years. Clifton Reeves was personally fined by the regulatory office and barred from serving in any official HOA capacity at Sycamore Ridge going forward. The fine was a matter of public record. The vehicle violation notice was formally withdrawn by the temporary board, and a written acknowledgement entered into the community record stating that my truck had not met the definition of a commercial vehicle under the community's governing documents, and that the original notice had been issued in error. I put both documents in the folder with everything else. The folder was now 67 pages. I labeled it, put it on the shelf in my study, and left it there. The full board election was scheduled 60 days after the special meeting. My name came up immediately among my neighbors as a candidate for president, and I want to be honest with you about what I did with that suggestion initially. I set it aside. I had come to Sycamore Ridge for quiet. I was 70 years old, and I had already spent more consecutive weeks in an adversarial proceeding than I had intended to spend in the entire remainder of my life. Board president was not quiet. Julieta came to see me first. She sat at my kitchen table and drank the coffee I made and told me, in the direct way that I had come to understand was simply how she communicated, that the community needed someone who understood the rules, respected the rules, and would not mistake a neighborhood association for a personal kingdom. She said she did not know anyone else who fit that description as completely as I did, and that if I chose not to run, I should be prepared to explain that decision to the people in this community who had trusted me with their stories. Then Herschel called. Then the Vanzettis sent a note. Then 4 other neighbors reached out over the following days, each of them separately, each of them making some version of the same point. I filed my candidacy on the last day of the nomination window. I ran on 3 commitments. Full financial transparency, with all vendor contracts posted to the community website and open for resident review. Consistent bylaw enforcement applied equally to every homeowner without exception. And term limits observed strictly, including my own. I stated publicly that I would serve a maximum of 2 terms and step down, and that I would support amending the governing documents to make term limits automatically enforced rather than dependent on someone noticing they were being violated. I won with 61% of the vote. My first official board meeting as HOA president of Sycamore Ridge was on a Wednesday evening in the community clubhouse. The room was fuller than any board meeting had been in years, which I took as both an encouragement and a responsibility. People show up when they believe the institution they are showing up to is worth their time. My job, starting that night and for every meeting that followed, was to make sure they remained correct in that belief. I want to tell you what the past 3 months actually taught me, because it was not what I expected when that orange notice appeared under my windshield wiper. I expected to fight a procedural battle. I knew how those worked, and I knew I could win one. What I did not expect was the breadth of what I found when I started looking. Not just Clifton-specific violations, but the accumulated weight of years of small injustices that people had absorbed and set down and learned to live around because they did not know they had the right to do otherwise. Julietta's wind chimes, Herschel's tomatoes, Walter's fence, the doormat, the holiday decorations, each one trivial in isolation. Together they formed a picture of a community that had been slowly taught that the rules applied to them, but not to the people who made the rules. That is the thing about small institutions without accountability. They do not announce themselves as corrupt. They simply become, over time, systems that serve themselves rather than the people they were built to serve, and they rely on the reasonable assumption that most people are too busy, too uncertain, or too exhausted to read the documents carefully enough to notice. So let me tell you what I want you to take from this, whether you live in an HOA community now or may one day in the future. Your governing documents are legally binding on the board. Not just on you, on them. Board members have term limits, conflict of interest obligations, notification requirements, and procedural rules they are required to follow. Most of them know that residents rarely read closely enough to hold them to it. Read closely. Your financial records are accessible by right in most states. If your HOA spends community money on vendor contracts, you are entitled to see those contracts. If you ask and are refused or delayed past the statutory deadline, that refusal is itself a violation worth documenting. Document everything. Dates, names, what was said, every letter and email. The difference between a frustrated complaint and a compelling case is almost always the quality of the documentation behind it. And if you find what I found, a pattern, a real documented pattern of violations, your state HOA regulatory office exists specifically to receive that documentation and act on it. You do not need an attorney to file a complaint. You need organized records and the willingness to submit them. I think about Nora when I sit at that board table. She would have found the last 3 months both completely exhausting and utterly unsurprising. She used to tell me I could not walk past something wrong without stopping. I used to tell her that was a character flaw that I was working on. Sitting in that chair on a Wednesday evening, looking out at a room full of neighbors who showed up because they believed the institution they were walking into was finally worth their time, I think she was right to push back on that. Some things you walk away from. Some things walk up and find you. And some things, it turns out, were exactly what you were supposed to be doing all along. Have you had any HOA or landlord issues? Tell me how you handled in the comment, and thanks for watching.